so today I'm going to be doing my May reading wrap up. I feel like I read so many books, even though I didn't, because I discovered a new thing. Audiobooks. I know, right? It's awesome. So before I get into that, I just want to say, like, it's so incredibly hot in Sweden right now. I don't think it's been like this hot since like 100 years ago or something. So I have to have the window open and my washing machine is on, so if you hear background noise, I'm sorry. And that also explains why my skin is so oily, because like I wish I could just walk around naked, it's so hot. Before I start babbling about stuff that are very not relevant, let's get into the books that I read in the month of May. So the first book that I read is The Toy Makers by Robert Dinsdale. This is one of those books that I was looking at in the bookstore and it was just speaking to me, you know. I've looked at it like twice or 3 times and gotten to the same bookstore and I just needed this book, and I understand why now, because this is like one of my favorite books. At least I read like this year. I don't know, like it's one of my favorite books. It's so good. So it's actually a historical fiction, but it's also magical realism, and which are both genres that I'm not a big fan of, but I'm actually really enjoying this one. So this book is about Kathy, and it follows her almost through her whole lifetime. So it takes place very in the early 1900s, and it follows Kathy through the World War I and World War II and what happens afterwards as well. And so Kathy, when she's very young, she gets pregnant and she decides to run away from home, and she finds a home at this emporium, which is these toy makers. So the shop makes toys, and in the toy shop there is this family, and the dad can basically make toys that seem alive or like are alive in a way, and the oldest son has the talent but the youngest one does not, and so you could see kind of their rivalry trying to win over the shop when their dad dies. And Kathy is just kind of like an outside player who comes into all this drama. It has a lot to do about war, and there's a lot of like symbolisms when it comes to these like soldiers, the real life ones and the fake ones and the ones in between, and it's really just so incredibly good. I could not recommend this book more. This is one of those books that, even though I didn't enjoy it like one of my favorite books ever, I felt like I could have read it again and again and again and never got tired of it, and just seen so many layers. So I highly recommend this book. It was so good. Oh, it was just, I loved it so much. Next, I read A Quart of Frost and Starlight by Sarah J. Maas. I was really excited about this book when it came out because I really like the series. This is from A Quart of Thorns and Roses series, I think, and this was kind of like a little novella thing after the 3rd book. And so this book doesn't have a plot like whatsoever. It's just like the summer solstice is going on and it's like blah 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 blah, and you get to follow like the characters or this friend group that the whole series is basically about. What I liked about that friend group before, like in the other books, I kind of hated about this one. Like, it was so awkward. Like, I was cringing the whole time. Like, I was just like, no, don't do that. And like, it was just so cringy, like the things they said and their like mannerisms. It was just, no, like I could not. It was like so bad. It was so bad. I give it 3 stars first because it has its moments, you know. Sarah J. Maas writing is pretty good, and it kind of, she has moments, but it was just not good in general, so I lowered it to 2 stars. Yeah, that was a disappointment, but it does have the prettiest cover in the series. Next, I read Saga Volume 6. I really like this comic actually a lot more than Volume 5, because I felt like 5 and I think it was 4 and 5, they had like drugs in them, and I just felt like it was very unnecessary. And this one, they kind of mention the drugs, but it's really not there. And this comic also has one of my favorite characters ever. It's like this little, I don't even know what animal it is. This little guy here, like, I love him so much because he's so incredibly cute in like this world that has so much like terror and killing and stuff, but his like comments and everything like give me life. Highly recommend this comic series. Yeah, and I enjoyed this one a lot more. The next book I read is Days of Blood and Starlight by Laini Taylor. This is the 2nd book in the Daughter of Smoke and Bone series, and this book definitely suffered from a middle book syndrome, you know, where like nothing happens in the book and it's just like blah 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 blah, and you're like, okay, get to the like fucking plot. and it just never happens. Yeah, this book definitely suffered from that, but I don't think it was badly written, and I really enjoyed the book, and I liked how it was like a completely different setting, but I think it could have been in more different settings. And I don't know, the beginning was really like hard to get into. I didn't understand what was happening at all for like the first 50 pages, and then when I read on, I had to actually go back. And it wasn't that long since I read the first book either, which I thought was pretty bad. So I don't know, this one definitely gave it a low rating than the first book, but I think that the third book is really gonna make up for it, because I like the story and I like the characters and everything, but the romance in this one is just so angsty, because you're like, they just had like a fight. I don't want to spoil anything. Like the main character says she's never gonna get together back together with him, and it's like, you're soulmates, like it's gonna happen eventually, like are you dumb? I don't know, it's just, I got a little bit annoyed, but in general I still highly recommend this series. So the next book I read was The Price Guide to the Occult by Leslie Walton, and this book actually has a pretty low rating, like a really low rating on Goodreads. I don't think I've ever read that low of a rating on Goodreads and liked it as much as I did. I really love this book. I thought it was so good. This kind of follows these witches that live on an island, and the main character, she's also a witch, but it kind of seems like she has some special abilities. But this main character actually struggles a lot with self-harm, and I did not know that when I went into the books. It was kind of like a shocker. I was not prepared, but of course, like, I'm over it by now, so I don't really get triggered by that, but it was definitely like a trigger warning for everyone else. I think the author handled it pretty well though, but I felt like there were some things that were kind of like stereotypical, which I really hate. Altogether, I thought this was a really good book, and I liked the concept. I felt like the ending was way more rushed, and you know, that when the beginning is so good, you get like, oh, this is such a good book, you know, you get so hyped up, and then towards the end it was like, okay, I kind of expected more, but I really liked the witch concept, and some of the characters I really liked. I think that some of the characters could have had more development. I think that some of the character names were described only once, like this person is this person, and then later when they mention the name, you've kind of forgotten what it is, but the author didn't remind you who this person was, and I don't like that. I like it when authors remind you who the people are, because it means that you have to pay attention so thoroughly all the time, and like, it doesn't happen when you read a book. Like, sometimes your mind is drifting and you have to bring yourself back. That always happens when I read, and I felt like this book could have just explained more, like it could have been thicker, but I still thought it was really good, and I actually really recommend it. Next, I read The Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Ruiz Zafón. This is actually a Spanish translated book, and it's one of my mom's favorite books, and it was also the book club of the month for my book club, and everyone said this is such an amazing book. It starts in 1945. You get to follow this character called Daniel since he's 10 years old, and he finds this book in this secret library, and when he reads the book, it's like one of his favorite books of all time, and when he tries to look up the author and find other books by the author, he doesn't find anything, and nobody sells the book. It doesn't exist anymore, and it turns out that his copy is the only copy that is left of any book he's ever written. And so he becomes really obsessed with this author and wants to find everything about his life. And it's just a really good premises, and it's sort of like a mystery. You can see that the author of the book that he finds in the book, kind of his life sort of glides into Daniel's life, and how they sort of are related on like a spiritual level. It's really cool. I think the concept is really cool. Unfortunately, this book was just so incredibly slow. I struggled so much. I even considered quitting the book and not going to the book club because it was just so slow. I think the ending was really good, and it has a classical ending where it's happy ending for almost everyone, and it wraps up and the bad guys get punished and the good guys live happily ever after, which I really enjoyed. That was like a nice wrap up, and the ending was sort of like, whoa, that was so incredible how things came together. Unfortunately, I can't recommend this book because I didn't enjoy it all that much since it was just so incredibly slow. But it might just be that this is not my type of book, and also the characters in the book, it was just like so long of an explanation, like the characters and the names, and it was just like the whole life story every time a new character came into the book, and sometimes it came back later and it was explained why you need to know all these things, but sometimes it wasn't, and it was just so slow. But I think if you like this kind of like historical fiction, mystery, dramas within families, then I think you'd like this book. Next, I read The Gigantic Beard That Was Evil by Stephen Collins. I wasn't planning on reading this book and I didn't have it at home even, but I found it at a thrift store in London, and I think this book would actually cost a lot because it's a really thick comic, and comics take a lot of money to make because the drawings and everything as well. So I probably wouldn't have read it at all if I didn't find it for a very, very cheap price. So I just read it in one day, and it was really funny. It's about this guy who lives on an island that's basically perfect, and the island's called Here, and out in the sea there's a place called There that no one goes, because if you go there you basically die. And everything in Here is like perfect, and the main character, he has like a daily routine that he goes through, and he has some things that like he does every single day that he can't not do, you know, and it's just really funny. It's like a funny story, but it has also a lot of layers and meaning that you can interpret into it. I thought it was a really like worth comic to indulge in, and I'm very glad I read it, but I don't know if it would be worth the price unless you're like really like this kind of like fun comic that has like, it's like a simple comic, and the art style looks like this, but it's also like really, like it's pretty good, but I don't know if it's worth the actual price. Then I read Red Sister by Mark Lawrence. The second book just came out and my friend gave it a high rating, so I'm so glad I read it. This was a really, really good fantasy. I think the concept is so amazing. It's about this girl called Nona, and she basically is sold from her family to this convent. There's a lot of steps in between, but she starts at this convent. I think it's Sisters of Sweet Mercy. Basically, at this convent, the girls there, they are raised to be killers in all types of fields, and they also have these magical powers that they're born with. There's 4 different types of powers that you can have, and it turns out the main character has a lot of hidden powers that she's not revealing to everyone else. And so I really liked this book, but I felt like it was almost like a disconnect between me and the book because the timing of things wasn't explained enough. I think that if the author would have said like, oh, 3 days later, or after this we went down here, or an hour later, or like a couple of days later, because sometimes from chapter to chapter you wouldn't know if there was like a month in between, or like hours. Like you had no idea. It was almost like the author had taken out time from the whole story, and it wasn't like a conscious decision, or at least it didn't feel like it. So I definitely would have changed that, because it almost made me disconnect from the characters, because I was constantly wondering like, okay, so when is this happening, you know? And that was like a major issue for me. But I really enjoyed the main character. She's so kick-ass. Like, who doesn't want to be her? Like, she has so many cool powers, and I love when like the main character is like unstoppable, you know, like there's no one who can beat her kind of thing. I love that, because she's savage. Like, she's savage. She's the definition of savage. So I really enjoyed her. I didn't unfortunately like the end of the book, kind of how it ended. It felt sort of irrelevant, and I sort of wish like the red string throughout the story would have been more prominent. It was kind of like, where is the story going? What is the plot? So I felt like the ending was kind of random, and you didn't really know who the bad guys are. And I felt like that was maybe like on purpose, because we didn't know how the bad guys was connected and that kind of thing. But I was just like, it felt like it needed a little bit more effort into the book. But this was one of those books that, even though it had a lot of issues, I just enjoyed it so much because the author just wrote it so incredibly well. It's definitely a page turner, and it's incredibly well written when it comes to like the language and what's happening. It's so action-packed. It sort of reminded me of The Name of the Wind in the way that it's like it is teaching at a school and you get to learn about all the classes, and the main character is amazing. But other than that, it's way more like fast tempo, and it has a way different premises. Towards the end, you kind of realize that it's also sort of like a dystopian or like a sci-fi, and you're like, wait, what? So I'm interested to see where the story goes, and I'm really excited. The last book that I read was A Close and Common Orbit by Becca Chambers. This is a companion novel to A Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, and I read that book before I started BookTube, and I really liked it. And it's one of those series, most of the books actually, where you can read them and you can pay attention even though you only read 10 pages every single day. And I really like that about books, how you don't need to be reading them like all the time to be able to remember and keep up. For example, Red Sister, the previous book, that one you have to read it quickly almost to be able to enjoy it to the potential. But for these books it's not. You can read it really, really slow and still enjoy it the same amount. And so this is a sci-fi that is so well done. I love this book. I actually started reading this a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, and I only read 50 pages because it was so incredibly slow. It's a very like character-based sci-fi because you get to follow all these different species like that interact on different planets, and it's really cool. The whole book is basically based upon the fact that species are different, and they've made species that sort of teach us something about ourselves when you're reading them, which I just think is so cool. I love that. And the species are so cool too, like I love them, and they're having all these conflicts that we're having in our society, but it's so much easier to see it from like a different lens. So what I did with this book to make it not seem as slow is that I bought the audiobook as well, and I listened to the audiobook while I was reading. So I listened to the audiobook in double the speed. And so if you listen to the audiobook in double the speed, you can't actually hear what they're saying, but if you're reading along with it, then you can. I don't know how that works, but it definitely works. And you're reading quicker than if you were just to read it normally, and I really liked that, and it made it so much more easier to read it. I think especially because it's kind of slow. And so you get to follow two perspectives. One girl who is raised by basically IAs, and another girl who is an IA, like artificial intelligence, and it's really cool seeing how human-like she is and her struggles in the human world and the relationship. It was just so amazing. I highly recommend this series actually, it's really good. And so those are all the books that I read this month, but I actually listened to audiobooks of Harry Potter 1, 2, and 3 as well, because someone told me that they had a really good narrator, Stephen Fry, and I was just like, yes, let's do it. And so I tried it out, and it was just so incredibly good because Stephen Fry has different voices for all the Harry Potter characters, and they're so good too. They sound like almost in the movie, except like Harry Potter, but I think it was so good, and it just made me like fall in love with the books again. Like I can't even like walk outside listening to music anymore. I just have to listen to like a Harry Potter book. It's like literally on that level. So I also read those 3 this month, which makes me understand why people read so many books when they talk about audiobooks and normal books, because I always thought, like, how do you have time for audiobooks? It's like 10 hours, you know? But it goes so quickly, and if you listen to it on 1.25 speed, it goes quicker, but you don't notice that much difference. So yeah, I highly recommend those. They were so good. So thank you guys so much for watching. I know I babble a lot, and I just can't help it. I don't know what to do about it, and I need to like cut down on what I say about a book, but it's so difficult. I don't know how to solve that, but I hope you guys enjoyed nonetheless, and I hope you guys all have an amazing and magical day, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye bye!